In the 13th century, there existed an empire so vast, so terrifying, that its very name struck fear into the hearts of kings from Baghdad to Budapest. The Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe, a dominion built on the thunder of hooves and the whisper of arrows. Under the banner of Genghis Khan and his descendants, these nomadic warriors had shattered armies, toppled dynasties, and rewritten the map of the known world. They were unstoppable. They were invincible, or so it seemed. But every empire, no matter how mighty, has its breaking point. Every war machine, no matter how perfect, has its flaws. And in the middle of the 13th century, from the sands of the Middle East to the storm-lashed coasts of Japan, the world would discover that even the Mongol juggernaut could be stopped cold. This is the story of how an empire that had conquered everything in its path finally met its match, not once, but in a series of devastating defeats that would shake the very foundations of Mongol power and change the course of history forever. The year was 1260, and the Mongol Empire stood at the pinnacle of its power. Under Mongol Khan, the empire had been divided among his brothers, each commanding vast territories and armies. In the west, Hulagu Khan, grandson of the great Genghis himself, had been given a mission that would cement Mongol dominance over the Islamic world. His orders were simple yet terrifying. Destroy the Abbasid Caliphate, crush the last remnants of Islamic resistance, extend Mongol rule to the very shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Hulagu's campaign had begun with the kind of systematic brutality that had made the Mongols legendary. In 1258, his siege engines had surrounded Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world and seat of the Abbasid Caliphate for over 5 centuries. The city that had once been the center of learning and culture, where scholars had preserved the wisdom of ancient Greece and pioneered advances in mathematics and medicine, now trembled before Mongol wrath. The siege was a masterpiece of Mongol military engineering. Catapults hurled massive stones against the city walls, while skilled Chinese engineers deployed the latest in siege technology. The defenders, led by the last Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim, watched helplessly as their fortifications crumbled under the relentless bombardment. When the walls finally fell, what followed was carnage on an unimaginable scale. For days, Mongol warriors poured through the breach, showing no mercy to man, woman, or child. The House of Wisdom, repository of centuries of human knowledge, was destroyed, its precious manuscripts thrown into the Tigris River until the waters ran black with ink. Chroniclers would later claim that the river ran red with blood for days. The Caliph himself was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by Mongol horses, bringing an end to the Abbasid dynasty that had ruled the Islamic world since 750. With Baghdad in ruins and the Caliphate destroyed, Hulagu turned his attention westward. His army, a terrifying fusion of Mongol cavalry, Chinese siege engineers, and allied forces from across the empire, swept through Syria like a plague. Aleppo fell after a brief siege. Damascus surrendered without a fight, its rulers choosing submission over annihilation. Christian populations, seeing the Mongols as potential allies against their Muslim rulers, often welcomed the invaders with open arms. By 1260, Mongol banners flew over the ancient cities of the Levant. The Mediterranean Sea, that great highway of civilizations, lay within sight of Mongol scouts. It seemed as though nothing could prevent Hulagu from completing his conquest of the Islamic world. The Mongol War Machine, refined through decades of conquest across Asia and Europe, appeared unstoppable. But the machine that had crushed so many enemies was about to encounter something it had rarely faced: organized, disciplined resistance from warriors who refused to bow before Mongol might. In the Nile Delta, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt watched the Mongol advance with growing alarm. These were no ordinary defenders. The Mamluks were slave soldiers, purchased as children and trained from youth in the arts of war. Forged in the crucible of constant conflict with crusaders and rival Muslim powers, they had become some of the finest heavy cavalry in the world. More importantly, they had studied Mongol tactics, learning from the defeats of others how these nomadic warriors fought and won. Sultan Qutuz, ruler of the Mamluk Sultanate, understood that Egypt stood as the last major Islamic power capable of resisting the Mongol onslaught. If the Mamluks fell, the entire Islamic world would lie prostrate before Hulagu's armies. The choice was stark: submit and preserve what remained of their power, or fight and risk everything in a desperate gamble for survival. When Hulagu's envoys arrived in Cairo bearing the traditional Mongol ultimatum, their words carried the weight of an empire that had never known defeat. Submit, they declared, and your people shall live. Resist, and you shall face the fate of Baghdad. The message was clear: bow before Mongol might or face total annihilation. Qutuz's response would echo through history. Instead of submission, he ordered the Mongol envoys executed, their heads displayed on the gates of Cairo. It was a declaration of war against an empire that spanned continents, a challenge that would soon be answered in blood and steel. But Qutuz was not merely making a gesture of defiance. He had been watching, learning, preparing. The Mamluk Sultan understood something that many of the Mongols' previous enemies had failed to grasp. The nomadic warriors who had conquered half the world were not invincible. They had weaknesses, patterns that could be exploited by those brave enough to stand and fight. The Mongol military system, for all its effectiveness, relied heavily on psychological warfare and the reputation of invincibility. Cities and armies often surrendered before the first arrow was fired, terrified by tales of Mongol brutality. But what happened when that fear was replaced by determination? What occurred when skilled warriors refused to break before the Mongol charge? Moreover, the Mongols were operating far from their traditional base of power. The steppes of Central Asia, where their horses could graze freely and their nomadic lifestyle provided natural advantages, were thousands of miles away. Here in the deserts and fertile valleys of the Middle East, they faced different challenges. Supply lines stretched thin across vast distances, the climate and terrain that favored their enemies. Most critically, they faced opponents who understood their tactics and had prepared countermeasures. As news of the executed envoys reached Hulagu, the Mongol commander faced an unexpected complication. Reports arrived from the east that would change everything. Mongke Khan, the great Khan and supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, had died during a campaign in China. The death of the great Khan meant that the empire's leadership was now in question, and Hulagu would be expected to return to Mongolia to participate in choosing the next supreme ruler. Faced with this crisis of succession, Hulagu made a fateful decision.
Indeed, my king.
He would return east with the bulk of his army, leaving behind only a force of about 20,000 men under his most trusted general, Kitbuqa. It was a calculated risk. Surely 20,000 Mongol warriors would be more than sufficient to complete the conquest of Egypt and finish what had been started in Baghdad. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything both sides had learned about warfare. In the rolling hills of Palestine, near a place called Ain Jalut, the Springs of Goliath, two armies prepared to clash. One carried the reputation of invincibility earned through decades of conquest. The other fought with the desperation of those who knew that defeat meant the end of their world. Neither army could have imagined that this battle would shatter the myth that had conquered continents. The Mongol force under Kitbuqa was smaller than the great hosts that had trampled China and devastated Eastern Europe, but it carried with it the same ruthless efficiency that had never known failure. These were veterans of countless campaigns, men who had ridden with Hulagu through the burning streets of Baghdad, warriors whose arrows had darkened skies from Korea to Syria. Kitbuqa himself was a figure of legend among the Mongol ranks, a Nestorian Christian who had risen through merit to command the most elite units of the empire. He embodied the Mongol principle that skill and loyalty mattered more than birth or blood. His troops revered him not just as a general, but as a living symbol of Mongol invincibility. Under his command rode the finest heavy cavalry in the world, mounted archers whose precision was unmatched, and the sophisticated siege engineers who had perfected the art of reducing cities to rubble. But across the dusty plains, Sultan Qutuz had assembled something equally formidable. The Mamluk army that gathered at Ain Jalut represented more than just another medieval host. These were professional soldiers in the truest sense, men who had dedicated their entire lives to the study of war. From childhood, they had trained in the courtyard of the citadel in Cairo, learning not just how to fight, but how to think like warriors. The Mamluks had done something that few of the Mongols' previous enemies had attempted. They had studied their foe. Refugees from Baghdad, survivors from Aleppo, anyone who had witnessed Mongol tactics and lived to tell the tale, had been questioned extensively. The Mamluk commanders understood how the Mongols deployed their forces, how they used feigned retreats to lure enemies into ambushes, how their psychological warfare broke the will of opponents before the battle even began. More importantly, they had identified weaknesses. The Mongol reliance on mobility could be turned against them if the battlefield was chosen carefully. Their preference for avoiding heavily fortified positions suggested they could be made uncomfortable in constrained terrain. Most critically, their reputation for invincibility was itself a weakness, for it made them perhaps overly confident when facing desperate opponents. On the morning of September 3rd, 1260, as the sun rose over the hills of northern Palestine, both armies prepared for what each believed would be a decisive victory. The Mongols, positioned with their backs to the rising sun, arranged themselves in the traditional formation that had conquered half the world. Light cavalry on the flanks, heavy cavalry in the center, with reserves positioned to exploit any breakthrough. But something was different about this battlefield. The Mamluk general Baibars had spent weeks studying the terrain around Ain Jalut, and his positioning of the enemy was no accident. The Mongols found themselves facing directly into the blazing morning sun, their vision impaired at the crucial moment when battle would be joined. Behind them, the hills rose steep and rocky, limiting their room for maneuver and cutting off potential retreat routes. Baibars had learned from every Mongol victory of the past 50 years. He understood that the key to their success lay not just in their individual skill, but in their ability to control the flow of battle through mobility and psychological pressure. If those advantages could be neutralized, if the Mongols could be forced to fight on terms that favored their enemies, then perhaps the impossible might be achieved. The battle began as so many Mongol victories had before. Kitbuqa's light cavalry swept forward in probing attacks, testing the strength of the Mamluk line, looking for weaknesses to exploit. Volleys of arrows darkened the sky, as the Mongol horse archers demonstrated the skill that had terrorized enemies from the Pacific to the Atlantic. The Mamluks absorbed these attacks behind their shields, giving ground slowly but maintaining their formation. Then came the moment that had broken so many armies before. The Mongol heavy cavalry, those terrifying horsemen whose charge had shattered the greatest powers of the medieval world, lowered their lances and thundered forward. The earth shook beneath their hooves as thousands of warriors crashed toward the Mamluk line with devastating force. But the line held. Instead of breaking like so many armies before them, the Mamluks absorbed the impact and struck back with disciplined fury. Their heavy cavalry, trained from childhood for exactly this moment, met the Mongol charge with equal force. Steel rang against steel as the finest warriors of two continents clashed in brutal melee combat. For hours, the battle raged with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. The Mongols, accustomed to quick victories achieved through superior mobility and shock tactics, found themselves locked in exactly the kind of grinding, attritional combat that played to Mamluk strengths. These Egyptian warriors were not the lightly armored infantry that usually crumbled before Mongol charges. They were professional soldiers whose training and equipment were specifically designed for this kind of warfare. As the sun climbed higher and the heat of the desert day intensified, both armies began to show signs of exhaustion. But it was here that Baibars revealed the masterstroke that would change the course of history. Throughout the morning, he had kept a significant portion of his army hidden in the hills surrounding the battlefield, invisible to Mongol scouts and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The signal came when Baibars judged that the Mongol reserves were fully committed to the grinding battle in the center. From the hills on both flanks, fresh Mamluk cavalry burst forth in a coordinated assault that caught the Mongols completely by surprise. The trap that had been hours in the making finally snapped shut. Kitbuqa, veteran of 100 battles, immediately recognized the danger. His army, strung out across the battlefield and exhausted from hours of combat, was being enveloped by fresh enemy forces. The Mongol general attempted to rally his men for a fighting withdrawal, but the careful positioning that Baibars had achieved made retreat almost impossible. The hills that had seemed like mere landscape features now became deadly obstacles. Mongol horsemen, trying to escape the closing trap, found their mounts struggling up steep slopes, while Mamluk cavalry struck them from multiple directions. The mobility that had been the foundation of Mongol success for generations was neutralized by terrain and tactics. What followed was not just a defeat, but a catastrophe. Kitbuqa fell fighting, his body pierced by Mamluk lances as he tried desperately to organize a defense. Around him, the army that had never known defeat dissolved into chaos. Some Mongol units tried to fight their way out of the encirclement, only to be cut down by disciplined Mamluk formations. Others attempted surrender, but found that quarter was not being given to the warriors who had shown no mercy at Baghdad. By sunset, the field of Ain Jalut was littered with the bodies of Mongol dead. Of the 20,000 warriors who had entered the battle that morning, only scattered survivors remained to carry word of the disaster back to their commanders. For the first time in living memory, a Mongol army had not just been defeated, but virtually annihilated. The psychological impact of the victory resonated far beyond the battlefield itself. Across the Islamic world, news of the Mongol defeat spread like wildfire. The warriors who had seemed invincible, who had inspired terror from China to Eastern Europe, had been stopped cold by soldiers fighting for their faith and their civilization. The myth of Mongol invincibility, that powerful psychological weapon that had opened city gates without siege and broken armies without battle, lay shattered in the dust of Palestine. But the reverberations of Ain Jalut extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. As word of the catastrophic defeat reached Hulagu Khan in distant Mongolia, the implications became clear. The western frontier of the Mongol Empire, once poised to sweep into Africa and complete the conquest of the Islamic world, had been permanently sealed. Damascus and Aleppo, which had fallen so easily to Mongol arms, were swiftly recaptured by Mamluk forces. The dream of Mongol dominion stretching from the Pacific to the Atlantic lay in ruins. Yet even as the Islamic world celebrated its salvation, another Mongol disaster was unfolding thousands of miles to the east. In the courts of Khan Balik, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis and ruler of the Mongol Yuan dynasty in China, nursed ambitions that dwarfed even his grandfather's conquests. His gaze had turned toward the island kingdom of Japan, that mysterious realm across the sea which had never felt the hooves of Mongol horses or heard the whistle of their arrows. The Japanese archipelago represented more than just another territory to be conquered. It was a symbol, a final frontier that would complete the Mongol domination of East Asia. From Korea to Burma, from Tibet to Java, every neighboring power had either fallen to Mongol arms or submitted to Mongol authority. Only Japan remained defiant, its samurai warriors and emperor untouched by the empire that had reshaped the world. Kublai's first embassy to Japan in 1268 had returned with contemptuous silence. The Japanese court, secure behind the protective waters of the Tsushima Strait, had simply ignored the Mongol demand for submission. It was an insult that no Mongol ruler could tolerate, a challenge that demanded an answer written in fire and steel. The invasion fleet that assembled in Korean ports in 1274 was a marvel of medieval logistics. Nearly 40,000 warriors crowded aboard 900 vessels, the largest seaborne invasion force the world had ever seen. Mongol cavalry, Korean infantry, Chinese engineers, and siege specialists from across the empire prepared to carry the storm of conquest across the waters to Japan. But the Mongols were about to discover that their mastery of land warfare did not automatically translate to success on the seas. The Japanese defenders they would face were unlike any enemy the empire had encountered. The samurai warrior class, forged through generations of internal warfare, had developed a martial culture that prized individual combat skill and death before dishonor. These were not the terrified peasant armies that typically fled before Mongol charges, but professional warriors whose entire identity was built around their willingness to face death. The initial landings on the islands of Tsushima and Iki had gone according to plan. The small Japanese garrisons, overwhelmed by sheer numbers, fought with desperate courage before being annihilated. But when the invasion fleet reached the shores of Kyushu, the main Japanese island, they encountered something unexpected. Instead of cowering behind fortifications, the samurai rode out to meet them on the beaches. The clash between Mongol and samurai represented a collision of two entirely different military philosophies. The Mongols fought as disciplined units, using coordinated archery and mass cavalry charges to break enemy formations. The samurai, trained in the traditions of individual combat, sought out worthy opponents for single duels, announcing their lineage and achievements before engaging in personal combat. At first, this difference worked to the Mongols' advantage. Samurai who approached expecting formal single combat were cut down by coordinated volleys of arrows or overwhelmed by groups of Mongol warriors fighting as a unit. The invaders established beachheads and began pushing inland, their superior numbers and battlefield tactics gradually wearing down Japanese resistance. But the Japanese were learning. Local commanders began adapting their tactics, using hit-and-run attacks to harass Mongol supply lines and avoid the kind of pitched battles that favored the invaders. The dense forests and mountainous terrain of Kyushu proved challenging for Mongol cavalry, while Japanese defenders who knew every path and hiding place could strike and disappear like ghosts. As autumn deepened into winter, the Mongol position became increasingly precarious. Their ships, anchored in exposed harbors, were vulnerable to the fierce storms that lashed the Japanese coast during the winter months. Supplies were running low, and the Japanese resistance, rather than crumbling under pressure, seemed to be growing stronger and more organized with each passing day. Then, on a night in late November, the sea itself turned against the invaders. A massive typhoon, roaring out of the Pacific with winds that could snap the masts of ships and waves that towered like moving mountains, struck the Mongol fleet with devastating force. In a single night, centuries of Mongol naval preparation were reduced to driftwood and corpses. The storm destroyed most of the invasion fleet outright. Ships were driven against rocky shores, crushed against each other in the churning waters, or simply swallowed by waves that defied human comprehension. Of the thousands of warriors who had landed with such confidence weeks before, only scattered survivors remained, stranded on a hostile shore with no hope of reinforcement or retreat. Those Mongols who survived the typhoon found themselves hunted through the forests and mountains of Kyushu by samurai who showed no mercy to foreign invaders. The disciplined war machine that had conquered China and terrorized Korea was reduced to desperate bands of refugees, picked off one by warriors who knew the terrain like their own gardens. When the few survivors finally limped back to Korea, they carried with them news of a catastrophe that shook the Mongol court to its foundations. An entire invasion force, the largest naval expedition in Mongol history, had been destroyed not by superior enemy tactics or better weapons, but by the sea itself. The Japanese, with a mixture of relief and religious awe, proclaimed that the gods themselves had intervened to save their homeland from foreign conquest. But Kublai Khan was not a ruler who accepted defeat lightly. The failure of the first invasion only strengthened his resolve to bring Japan under Mongol dominion. For 7 years, the resources of the Yuan dynasty were mobilized for a second, even larger invasion. This time, nothing would be left to chance. The fleet that would carry Mongol power across the waters would be so vast, so overwhelming, that no storm or samurai resistance could prevent victory. The second invasion force that assembled in 1281 dwarfed even the massive expedition of 1,274. Over 4,000 ships carrying nearly 140,000 warriors represented the largest seaborne invasion in human history, a record that would not be surpassed until the Allied landings in Normandy 6.5 centuries later. The flower of Mongol military might, veterans of campaigns across Asia, prepared to settle the question of Japanese independence once and for all. Yet for all its size and preparation, the second invasion would prove an even greater disaster than the first. The Japanese had not wasted the intervening years. Coastal defenses had been strengthened, the samurai had learned to fight more effectively against Mongol tactics, and most importantly, they had developed a burning determination to resist foreign conquest at any cost. The invasion began promisingly enough for the Mongols. Their massive fleet landed successfully on multiple beaches, establishing strong beachheads and pushing inland with overwhelming force. Japanese resistance, while fierce, seemed insufficient to stop such a colossal military machine. For weeks, it appeared that sheer numbers would finally accomplish what had failed 7 years before. But the gods of storm and sea had not finished with the Mongol Empire. In August of 1281, as the invasion reached its critical phase, another typhoon struck the Japanese coast with even greater fury than the storm of 1,274. This time, the Mongol fleet was not just damaged but virtually annihilated. Ships that had seemed as numerous as grains of sand on a beach were scattered like leaves in an autumn gale. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of Mongol warriors drowned in the churning waters or were dashed against the rocks. Those who managed to reach shore found themselves facing samurai who had been preparing for this moment for 7 years. The survivors of the greatest invasion fleet in history were systematically hunted down and destroyed, their bodies left to feed the crows on beaches that had become graveyards. From the sands of Palestine to the storm-lashed shores of Japan, the world had witnessed something extraordinary. The empire that conquered everything in its path had finally met forces it could not overcome. Courage, strategy, and the fury of nature itself had shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility. These defeats marked more than military setbacks. They changed the course of history, preserving civilizations and proving that even the mightiest empire has limits that cannot be crossed. The reverberations of these catastrophic defeats would echo through the centuries, fundamentally altering the trajectory of world history. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluks had achieved something that seemed impossible. They had shattered the aura of invincibility that had been the Mongols' greatest weapon. In the waters off Japan, nature itself had delivered a judgment that no amount of military genius could overturn. The empire that had redrawn the map of the known world discovered that there were limits even to Mongol ambition. These defeats marked the beginning of the end for Mongol expansion. Never again would their armies sweep across continents with the same unstoppable momentum. The Islamic world, saved by Mamluk courage at Ain Jalut, would endure and flourish. Japan, protected by divine winds, would develop in isolation for centuries, creating a unique culture that might never have existed under Mongol rule. The very course of civilization had been altered by these moments when the world finally fought back. The lesson of these epic confrontations resonates across the ages. No empire, no matter how mighty, is truly invincible. Every war machine, no matter how perfect, can be stopped by the right combination of courage, strategy, and sometimes the intervention of forces beyond human control. The Mongol Empire's greatest defeats remind us that even in history's darkest hours, when all seems lost, the human spirit's refusal to submit can change everything. Sometimes, against all odds, David really can defeat Goliath.